Entry into a confined space can be one of the most hazardous activities undertaken in the workplace. In the UK, many workers are killed or injured each year when they fail to take adequate safeguards before entering confined spaces. Whether you work in a confined space every day or only very rarely, you must always exercise extreme caution and care. It only takes one false move for disaster to strike. So what do we mean when we talk about confined spaces? Generally, a confined space is an area which has limited openings for personnel to enter and exit, and it's not designed for regular occupancy. A confined space has the potential to contain or cause an accumulation of atmospheric hazards. They may also have a deficiency or oversupply of oxygen. Common examples of confined spaces are tanks, reaction vessels, large ducts, silos, enclosed drains and sewers, or any area where there is restricted air circulation. What about the following work areas? Which of them do you think is a confined space? All of these areas can in fact be classified as confined spaces. For example, even this shallow drain represents a confined space hazard if air circulation is poor or if a gas accumulates at the bottom. Think about the range of confined spaces which may be present in your work environment. Pause the video and make a list of these areas. Do you have to go into any of these areas? Also think about the major hazards associated with these confined spaces. In this video, we will be looking at the types of hazards you need to be aware of before undertaking confined space entry, effective permit to work schemes, how to carry out an assessment of hazards and put into place all suitable risk reduction measures in accordance with UK and EC guidelines. We will also look in detail at confined space testing procedures, safe work practices, hot work in confined spaces, emergency responses, and equipment maintenance and storage. You should always approach a confined space with the assumption that it is a danger area. They involve more risks than other areas because they are often poorly ventilated. They may also contain harmful gases, which you will not be able to detect without special equipment. And they pose extra hazards in an escape or rescue situation. One of the primary hazards is gas and vapor concentrations, which can arise from sources both within and outside a confined space. For example, there may be gases or vapors remaining from a process which the confined space has been used for. It may be possible for gases or vapors to enter the space from a adjoining plant. When sludge or other deposits are disturbed, then fumes can be emitted, and hazardous fumes may be produced by an operation being carried on inside the confined space, such as welding, painting, or the use of adhesives or solvents. Another major hazard associated with confined space work is either a deficiency or an oversupply of oxygen. For example, when a confined space is purged with an inert gas to displace contaminants, then a lowering of oxygen levels will occur. Rotting organic matter in a confined space produces methane, and this will diminish oxygen levels. Oxygen can also be absorbed by grains, chemicals, or soils. Be particularly wary of vessels which have been left closed for a considerable amount of time. Oxidizing surfaces inside may have significantly reduced the level of oxygen. Always make sure that the oxygen level of a confined space is in the range of 19.5% to 21% of air. When oxygen levels fall below 19.5%, you will start to develop symptoms such as fast breathing, increased heartbeat, drowsiness, and nausea. At levels below 18%, you can start to fall into a coma. Oxygen levels above 21% can also be a hazard, as this dramatically increases the risk of a fire or explosion occurring. A leaking oxygen supply to gas-cutting equipment, for instance, can quickly raise oxygen levels in the space. A buildup of flammable gases, dust or vapors, is another major combustion hazard to guard against. You should also be constantly aware of the range of physical hazards which you can be subjected to. Heat levels, for instance, can build up quickly in confined spaces and can lead to heat exhaustion, or in extreme cases, a heat stroke. Falls and slips are a common hazard, especially in poorly lit and moist conditions. Avoid contact with potential irritants such as residue, solvents, or scale. Remember to keep your protective clothing on if irritants could be a problem. When working in a confined space, noise levels will be amplified and can cause hearing damage unless you are wearing adequate protection. Noise levels can also increase the risk of directions or warnings not being heard. Other potential hazards include the possibility of material shifting and engulfing you, unexpected movement of machinery, and electrocution risks. Whenever practicable, confined spaces should be signposted and secured, and information provided concerning the hazards associated with working in those areas. Before starting work in a confined space, you must obtain a permit to work. This document indicates what work is to be done and will detail the specific entry procedures which must be followed before you're permitted to enter a confined space. The permit should also clearly set out details of who will supervise the work, the individuals who are to carry out each section of the work, the safety precautions which have been taken prior to entry, all precautions which need to be taken by personnel, the equipment and clothing required, emergency precautions which should be in place, a time limit for the work, and the procedure that should be followed before the permit to work is cancelled. The permit must be signed by a designated authority and by the person responsible for undertaking the work. This person then retains a copy of the permit. All persons subject to the permit should have the opportunity of seeing the permit or having its contents explained to them. The permit should also be prominently displayed at the job site. It's important to have separate permits for each specific job, location, person, and time. Permits should also not be carried from one shift to the next. Once the work is completed, then the person in charge of the work re-signs the permit and returns it to the designated authority. The designated authority should in turn check that the work is completed and that personnel have left the space before a return to service is authorized. Before a permit to work is issued, a thorough risk assessment of the situation must be carried out by an experienced person. The assessment should take account of the nature of the confined space, the work to be done, the work methods, the hazards involved, and emergency and rescue procedures. Take, for example, this grain elevator area. What hazards do you think could be present? And what characteristics of the space could cause problems for personnel having to enter and work in this area? Also make a note of the atmospheric testing which should be undertaken, the PPE which should be worn, the range of equipment needed to safely enter the space, and the emergency and rescue procedures which should be in place. If a confined space assessment identifies a risk, then steps must be taken to reduce the risk. When considering how to reduce risks, the first objective should be to find an alternative to entry into the confined space. For example, could an automated cleaning system be introduced? Or can a piece of equipment be taken out of the confined space for repair? Entry and working in a confined space should only be considered where no other viable alternative exists. Can a hazardous process undertaken in a confined space be substituted by a less hazardous process? Redesign should also be considered. Some examples of redesign include the installation of removable vent covers to assist ventilation, a davit or lifting beam which makes it easier to use a hoist. Can better ventilation and monitoring systems be introduced? Have openings been made as large as possible? And can access to confined space entry points be improved? If a confined space assessment identifies a risk, then steps must be taken to reduce the risk. Prior to entry into a confined space, there are a number of safety steps which should be taken. Firstly, the plant should be withdrawn from service so that production personnel do not open valves or activate machinery whilst other personnel are in the confined space. The person in charge of the process should be required to certify on your permit that the plant has been withdrawn from service and that all relevant plant operators have been advised of the withdrawal. Warning notices should also be displayed and protective barriers erected to prevent entry of persons not involved in the work. The next step is to prevent dangerous materials or gases from entering the confined space. The safest course is to disconnect the space from other items of plant and seal off outlet pipes. Metal blanks and full-face gaskets should be applied to those pipes still connected to sources of danger. Where disconnection is not possible, isolation should be achieved by inserting a spade between pipeline flanges and then testing the joints for leakage. Also make sure that any moving parts in the space have been isolated, blocked, and if necessary, de-energized. Electricity should be turned off and fuses removed. Locks and tags should then be applied to prevent unauthorized personnel from opening valves or activating equipment. Even if you are entering a space for only a few minutes, don't simply rely on closed valves. Take the time to make sure that other safeguards are in place. Once again, details of these safeguards should be provided in your permit to work. And it's good practice for the issuer of the permit to actually show you all the control measures which have been taken for your safety. All hazardous materials, whether they be solids, liquids or gases, must be removed from the confined space. If the confined space contains powder or granular material, there may be a dust explosion risk, for which damping down with water or the injection of an inert gas could be possible controls. The ventilation or cleaning method used will depend on the material present. Cold or hot water may be suitable for the removal of water-soluble chemicals, and steam cleaning for the removal of oily residues. Other methods include high-pressure water jetting and solvent cleaning. Make sure that all safeguards, such as the provision of adequate ventilation to prevent a rupture or a collapse of the vessel, are in place. Cleaning and ventilation equipment should also be earthed to guard against static electricity discharge. If purging flammable gas or vapor with an inert gas such as nitrogen or carbon dioxide, make sure that the inert gas is in turn purged with air to avoid a toxic or asphyxiation hazard being created. The next step in your pre-entry procedure is to carry out atmospheric testing of the confined space. One of the most common causes of confined space accidents is a failure by personnel to adequately test the atmosphere prior to entry. There are three types of tests which will identify the atmospheric hazards of confined spaces. Oxygen level tests, flammability, including dust level tests where appropriate, and toxicity tests. Use your confined space entry permit as a guide. It should list the tests which are needed for each specific space, acceptable testing equipment and procedures, and the atmospheric conditions that are acceptable for safe entry. Before using testing equipment, make sure it is operating correctly by giving it a function test. The equipment should also be calibrated and fully inspected on a regular basis. Do not use the detector if the calibration date has expired or the unit looks physically damaged. Tests should, wherever possible, be undertaken from outside the space using remote probes and sampling lines. If covers need to be removed, then to begin with, open them as little as possible. Once a cover is open, it's a good idea to allow 5 to 10 minutes for lighter than air gases to escape before commencing full testing. Make sure you are standing upwind of the opening and don't stand directly over the opening. Test vertical levels of the space starting at the top and gradually working down to the bottom. This way you can detect all contaminants which may be displaced as a result of weight. Where possible, disturb any sludge before testing so as to release trapped gases or vapors. Test as much of the space's horizontal area as you can. Results of the testing should be recorded on your permit to work or on a sheet which is then attached to the permit. If a test shows the air to be unsafe, the hazard must be controlled before anyone enters the space. If testing indicates the space is safe to enter, continuous monitoring of the atmosphere should still be undertaken, ideally using instrumentation which incorporates both visual and audible alarms. If it is necessary for a person to enter a vessel to carry out a test, they must wear suitable breathing apparatus together with a safety harness and lifeline. Once all factors likely to affect the safety of the operation have been taken into account, a decision can then be made concerning whether entry with or without breathing apparatus is required. As a general rule, never enter a confined space without a potential rescuer standing by. This person must be trained in first aid and the use of safety equipment. Remaining in constant communication with this outside attendant is vital. In situations where voice or visual contact is impractical, then use hand or rope signals or radio communication. If hand or rope signals are required, then go over the signals before entering the confined space to make sure there is no misunderstanding. Make sure you are wearing a harness and always remain attached to a lifeline unless this creates a hazard by unduly restricting your movement. Don't smoke or eat in a confined space. Always stay alert to the possible hazards. And if you feel any warning signs, such as dizziness or breathlessness, then get out quick. Make a point of using explosion-proof lighting. Hand tools or equipment should be non-sparking and preferably battery-powered. If you are using electricity, then make sure all plugs, insulation and grounds are checked. A ground fault circuit interrupter should also be in place. Carrying out hot work in a confined space creates additional hazards which you must constantly be aware of. Specific precautions and careful planning are vital. Hot work activities consume oxygen. Your limited air supply could be used up by the flame of a gas torch or welder, leaving you with insufficient oxygen. The confined space may contain flammable gases or an oversupply of oxygen, all of which adds to the fire hazard. Working with a flame on certain materials can release toxic fumes, which may lead to asphyxiation or possibly an explosion. It's vital that an effective hot work permit scheme is in place to specify the particular safety measures needed when undertaking hot work in a confined space. For instance, all flammable liquids and combustibles should be removed from the confined space. Firefighting equipment should be on hand. And it's also good practice to have a trained person standing fire watch. Over half the people killed in confined space accidents are in fact the people trying to rescue someone. Rushing into a confined space to save a co-worker without taking appropriate precautions could cost both of you your lives. If a worker is in trouble, you should immediately phone or call for help. Your next response should be to start up ventilation equipment, but do not feed extra oxygen into the confined space, as this could create additional combustion hazards. Use the lifeline or harness to pull the victim out. Under no circumstances should you attempt to enter the confined space unless you are properly trained and equipped to deal with an emergency, and there are other personnel on hand to assist. In an emergency, the existence of a confined space register detailing the characteristics of each confined space will greatly assist rescue workers. When using personal protective equipment, remember that it must match the hazard. Respirator filters and cartridges should be specific to the type of hazard or hazard class against which they will be used. Air purifying respirators must not be used in confined spaces where there is a potential oxygen deficiency or a highly toxic atmosphere. It's your responsibility to keep all confined space entry equipment, as well as your PPE, in top working order. Regular maintenance and proper storage must be regarded as a top priority. Adopt a slack attitude and you're asking for trouble. Inspect your equipment before and after use and make sure you report any rips, tears or defects to your supervisor. Remember that your equipment must meet the appropriate UK or EC standards. Confined space accidents can be prevented if you take the time to carefully plan your work and assess the hazards which could confront you. Remember to never underestimate these hazards and learn how to deal with them safely. Always follow established safety procedures. Only enter confined space if you have the appropriate permit, and make sure you've complied with all the requirements stipulated on that permit. Too many people throughout the world have become the victims of confined space work. Many dangers exist, and it's up to you to stay alert and get out quick if you notice any warning signs. Don't end up as another statistic. Always practice confined space safety.